recognize that the Champlain Valley Unitarian Universalist Society gathers on the traditional lands of the Western Abenaki people. We respect the Abenaki's spiritual and life-giving relationship to this land. We seek to honor the living traditions of the Abenaki and other First Nations, and we humbly hope to learn from them how we may better live in harmony, peace, and justice.
Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Champlain Valley Unitarian Universalist Society's Worship Online. I'm Liam B. Greenwood, your worship associate for this morning, and we're so glad you've joined us. You may be joining us through Zoom, and I see your amazing faces, or you may be viewing a few seconds later or a day later on YouTube. Either way, welcome. Now, if you're joining us through Zoom, you can stay on for our coffee hour later. If you're seeing on YouTube, you can join that link and join us for coffee hour. Bring your own cup of coffee, and we'll be broken up into small chat rooms, and we can talk about the service, talk about how we bake bread, and connect in friendship. Also, if you'd like to share any milestones and passages with us, if you're on Zoom, just type them into the chat and I will be reading them or sharing them later in the service for those who are not in Zoom with us. If you'd like to send in yellow cards, as we call them, or personal concerns, just send them to the CVUUS office. Now, during the summer months, Reverend Barnaby Feeder has a few weeks off from worship preparation. He's still working hard, but he's not helping us prepare worship. No, we as members of CVUUS are cooking up our own spirituality in the arts. And this week we're looking at bread making, the art of bread making. Joanna Caldwell, Jean Terwilliger, Michelle Lowry, and myself have prepared some reflections. And Shannon LaRose, Connie Leach, Chris Prickett, Sydney Singh, and Kate Gridley have added some sweet musical elements. Admittedly, this is a homemade production with lots of love woven into it, but not necessarily perfection. And with that in mind, I'd like to share our call to worship, which is a poem written to Jean Terwilliger by her daughter, Maddie, in honor of Jean's homemade bread. It doesn't matter that the bread falls apart because my mom made it. It crumbles and breaks in half, but it doesn't matter because my mom makes it. She lovingly kneads the bread and then watches it rise before forming her not quite perfect loaves. And then she makes my lunch with her homemade bread, turkey, lettuce, and cheddar cheese between two slices of love. Ask you now to join me in our chalice lighting and then a reading with our chalice lighting. We light this chalice knowing that its light calls us together and enfolds the various flowers of our characters into one loaf: white flour, brown whole wheat, and dark rye, some sourdough starter, and a pinch of salt, honey gathered from bees visiting wild flowers, and butter from the cows grazing in the pastures. We are stirred together within the chalice of community. We are warmed by the flame of thoughtful spirituality, social action, intentional friendships, and open hearts. During this hour of worship, may we rise together. Within the summer sun of this season, may we bake and become the bread of compassion for our world. We will not be perfect, but we will be homemade with love.
I make challah bread most Fridays, and here I am dipping into my 50-pound bag of King Arthur bread flour, and I'm adding flour to a bowl that has warm water, and some yeast has been dissolved in there a little while ago. There's honey in there, there's eggs, melted butter, and salt. This is a really big batch of challah bread, and the reason I'm making such a big batch in this video is that this is part of a project that was started by our own wonderful Caitlin Gildrian, and we're calling it the League of Willing Cooks. And every Friday we bring meals to Black activists in our community. Mostly they are in Rutland, but there's some up here in Addison County and points north, and they get a meal delivered to them on Fridays. And so in this video I'm making a kind of a giant baking of challah for many different families who are going to be getting fresh bread with their delivered meal. This is a Jewish tradition to have challah on Shabbat, on Friday, and I didn't really grow up with this tradition. We had challah bread sometimes in my house. I don't remember having homemade challah. I do remember one time my mom and I baked challah bread from scratch together as a school project, and I think it was in 4th grade, and it came out really, really well. And I don't know if that either of us had ever baked homemade bread before that, so maybe that experience just stuck with me, and later in life I became a devoted challah baker. So after the flour's been incorporated into the dough, we put it to rise. And this is something I just love about baking bread, is you can do so many other things now while your dough is rising. So here we are later. Actually, this dough, we didn't quite get the picture in the video, but it really grew ginormous, like a giant mushroom that was coming way up over the top of the bowl, and unfortunately we didn't get a picture of that. But now I'm getting ready to make strands, and that's how you braid the challah. You have to make 3 strands for each loaf, although you can do really fancy 4 and 5 strand loaves of challah. This is the classic 3-strand braid, and I just read on the internet that the strands, arms intertwined, symbolize love, truth, peace, creation, freedom, harmony, family connection, unity, and justice. So all these years I've been braiding my challah loaves, and I never knew that it was a symbol of all of those wonderful things. So after you braid your loaf, you put it to rise once more. And then this is after that second rising, we brush some beaten egg onto the top of the loaves. And that is so that your seeds will stick. And I always like to put sesame seeds and poppy seeds on top of my loaves. Challah is a really easy bread to bake. It's really forgiving, and even though, like I said, I didn't grow up baking it so much in my childhood, I feel very connected to my Jewish heritage and to my ancestors whenever I make challah bread. And I love how it kind of always comes out good. It's just very forgiving, and it makes people really happy to receive a loaf of fresh challah. This was only about, I think, maybe a third of how much challah we got out of that giant batch. And if anybody wants the recipe for this challah bread, I will be happy to share it with you. Here I am taking it out of the oven, and it's golden and beautiful. Shabbat Shalom.
Pies from Nowhere: How Georgia Gilmore Sustained the Montgomery Bus Boycott. When Georgia Gilmore was a young girl, and when she grew up, she lived on a farm in Alabama where she took care of the animals and learned how to cook. As an adult, Georgia got a job at the National Lunch Company in Montgomery, Alabama. She was a cook. Because of the segregation laws, white people ate at one part of the counter and black people ate at a different part of the counter. It wasn't right, but that's the way things were. On December 1st, 1955, while she was working, Georgia heard on the radio that a black woman named Rosa Parks had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. The next day, flyers went up all over Montgomery, telling the black people of the city to not ride the buses. Georgia saw many buses going by empty. Not long after, she went to Holt Street Baptist Church to hear Dr. Martin Luther King speak. We are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Those were things Georgia believed in, and she was willing to fight for them. So she decided to help the way she knew best. She gathered together a group of women, and they started cooking. They brought food to the meetings that followed at church. They sold sandwiches. They sold dinners in their neighborhood. As the bus boycotters walked and walked, Georgia cooked and cooked. They donated the profits from their food sales to the Montgomery Improvement Association, which helped fund the boycott. But if anyone had found out these women were involved, they could have lost their jobs. So Georgia ran the operation, and the other women acted as secret helpers. They sold food all over the city, especially pies. Every Monday and Thursday, Georgia would go early to the boycott strategy meetings at the church. She'd walk up to the collection plate and announce how much her group was contributing. There was cheering, clapping, foot stomping. But whenever people asked her where the money came from, she remembered her promise to keep it secret. It came from nowhere, she'd say. Because of this, her brave group of women bakers became known as the Club from Nowhere. But Montgomery didn't want their buses to continue to lose money, so they did what they could to stop the protesters. Dr. King and 89 others were arrested for their roles in the boycott, and Georgia was called to speak in church about how she had been mistreated. After she had already paid, the bus driver demanded she get off and enter through the back of the bus. When I reached the back door and was about to get on, he shut the door and pulled off, and I didn't even ride the bus after paying my fare. So I decided right then and there I wasn't going to ride the buses anymore, Georgia testified. But when her bosses at the National Lunch Company found out that she was part of the boycott, she was fired from her job. Georgia was unemployed and had 6 children to take care of. She needed to find a new way to support her family. Dr. King encouraged her to start her own business. He helped her improve the kitchen in her home, and Georgia got new pots and pans and cooking supplies. She opened a restaurant in her own house. Word got around and people came to eat at Georgia's. She was providing good food for her community, but she was also bringing the people of Montgomery together, black and white. On November 13th, 1956, when Georgia was cooking, the radio announced the Supreme Court had declared that segregation on buses was illegal. The boycotters had won. Georgia was thrilled. People could ride the bus and sit anywhere they wanted. Still, there would be more battles to fight, so Georgia Gilmore kept right on cooking.
Good morning. I'm Jean Terwilliger, and I would like to thank Liam for giving me this opportunity to reflect on why I love to bake bread. My grandmother, Helen Berger, grew up living above and working in her family's German bakery in Milwaukee and baked for my family all of her life. Long after she no longer had any feeling in her fingers, she still hand-rolled and crafted cinnamon-crusted elephant ear pastries, which she brought along on weekend trips to our family cabin in central Wisconsin. Her pies, cakes, cookies, and custard were made and shared with love. While my grandmother rarely baked bread, she did pass down the desire to provide loving sustenance to my mom, who baked us the healthiest possible whole grain breads and passed down the love of baking to my sister and I. I'm so glad that Liam suggested sharing bread as a lead up to this service, as sharing is one of my favorite reasons to bake, and the pandemic has, for many reasons, brought most of my sharing to a halt. It is amazing to think that it was only a few months ago that I brought apple pie and breads to my office to watch them be consumed over the course of a day. It is so satisfying to create joy with baking and to pass down that joy through the generations to my kids, who now also love to bake bread. Baking for me is also a path to spiritual sustenance, often as physical and social sustenance as well. I bake to relax. I bake as a meditation. I bake for the sensory experience. I bake to be able to share food with friends, creating new memories. And I bake to experiment and try new things. Baking is a simple act of creation that can fit into almost any time and space, from a quick batch of muffins to a 36-hour sourdough bread with many touch points along the way to ensure its progress and success. On a recent TED Talk about the power of spaces, Siamak Hariri, architect of the stunning Baha'i temple in Santiago, Chile, said that he grew up associating beauty and aspiration with what you are here on this planet to do, that your work, if really done well, with care, is an act of worship, an homage to your higher purpose. I think that this act of creating beauty, of art and craft, is just as relevant to baking as it is to architecture. While occasionally my architecture work feels like it rises to the level of worship, it often takes years to see the results. With baking, I get to create, enjoy, and share beautiful and delicious treats in just an hour or two. So if you haven't yet taken up bread baking, start with something simple and forgiving. Not French bread, not sourdough. Dissolve your yeast in just hot tap water. Stir in the rest of the ingredients to form a loose dough. Turn it out and knead until it feels like a soft baby's bottom and you have released all the tension from your body. Let it rise at room temperature until a poke sends it falling. Turn it over and form it into a loaf. And bake until the top is nice and crusty and the bottom has a hollow sound when you knock on it. Then slice it, inhale the wonderful aroma, and create some memories by sharing it with someone you love. Happy baking.
Wow. We're just partway through our service, and in the comments or the chat was a wish that we had smell-o-vision. That so many beautiful gifts are part of this service. I want to thank Michelle Lowy for that beautiful reading also of Pies from Nowhere. As we look at milestones and passages, there are just two that I'd like to mention. One is an explanation and a milestone and passage. Joanne Caldwell was so excited about having a service on bread making. And then after the schedule was set, she realized that this weekend was the weekend she and Wynn were going to be traveling into the Adirondacks to commit the ashes of their father-in-law, Ted, to the earth. And so it's her milestones and passage that I'm mindful of, and very grateful that even as she's celebrating the gift of Ted's life, she's also sharing her life with us through her bread making reflections. The other passage I'm aware of, I witnessed when I was delivering blueberry muffins. I was delivering blueberry muffins to Barnaby and Michelle's home, and I just happened to be there at the right time. They invited me in, and with our masks on, we listened to Barack Obama celebrate the love and grieve the loss of Senator John Lewis. And as you know, Senator Lewis shaped so many bloody and challenging milestones within our nation as he not just joined, but inspired many marches for civil rights, for Black Americans and people of color. And Obama really beautifully honored his legacy and challenged us all to continue that march, in any way that we can until we are all free and respected. So with the milestones of our nation, and the milestones of our lives in mind, join me in this 2-minute meditation as Jean Terwilliger kneads some bread for us. Hello, Liam Batches Greenwood here, and I want to talk to you about the amazing gift of yeast. When I was a new father, one of the joys of my life was to make bread with my kids every Tuesday. And when my daughter was 3 or 4 years old, she had this question about what is yeast? And I explained to her that yeast are actually alive. They're little organisms, little animals that love sugar, just like her brother loves sugar. And that yeast, when they're given what they love, something sweet, they eat it up and then they burp. And it's the burping that puts a little air bubble in the bread and makes the bread fluffy. They eat and burp, eat and burp, eat and burp. The thing about yeast, she was concerned. Dad, if the yeast are alive, why do you keep them in the freezer? I had to explain that they just sleep that way, and you have to wake them up very gradually. So I have some yeast in here. I'm also going to be experimenting with making Vermont maple wheat bread. And so the sugar I'm going to give them is this diluted maple syrup in warm water, lukewarm water. She had to be able to touch the water to make sure it wasn't too hot, because otherwise we would burn the yeast. But we would just put the water in there and really slowly give the yeast something to eat. They love, I'm sure, that Vermont maple syrup. I'm also going to put in a little bit of milk. Milk helps everybody to grow. Yes. And then some King Arthur flour. King Arthur flour. I just learned that King Arthur Flower is doing very well during this quarantine time. King Arthur Flower is a employee-owned business, a smaller flour mill, and it's the smaller flour mills that people are turning to when they're doing their own COVID baking, of being at home. And King Arthur Flour has been the choice of many Vermonters. Why is that? Actually, because they're very socially active. And even though they're called King Arthur Flour, they're owned by the employees. So there's not really a king. It's everybody. And it benefits everybody. They're a really good choice if you want to avoid big corporations and corporate farmers. I would suggest that doing things that are socially active and pursuing social justice is a little bit like being the yeast in the dough of the world. That we are exposed to a sweet message, such as King Arthur Flour being employee owned, and we eat up those sweet messages, and then we speak up. Speak up, and speaking up is a little bit like burping. And when we eat something sweet, when we take in some sweet thoughts, some social justice thoughts, and then we stand up and speak out, we make a little burp, we actually help the bread dough of our society to rise, because we all rise together. So my friends, if you can imagine yourself as a little yeast, and you are part of CVUUS, and as part of the UUs, we will offer you a lot of sweet thoughts about how we can grow in our social awareness. Soak up those sweet thoughts, eat it up, bite by bite, and then burp. In other words, speak up, because in that way, you help us all to rise. Blessed be. So as we're preparing for the offering, I offer you a few more sweet thoughts. Eat it up and burp gently. So this month, we are partnering with the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund. The NAACP is America's premier organization fighting for racial justice. Through litigation, advocacy, and public education, the Legal Defense Fund seeks to expand democracy, eliminate disparities, and achieve racial justice for all Americans. If you'd like to add to the inspiration of John Lewis's memorial service, then please, I would suggest search NAACP 60 Minutes and watch that episode as soon as possible. NAACP 60 Minutes, and there's an amazing interview with Sherilyn Ifill, who's the director of the Legal Defense Fund. The interview offers some really insightful views on the social unrest that we're experiencing now as a nation. And we're going to be showing a small slice of this interview just before the offertory, but it's just a slice. Go to NAACP 60 Minutes for the whole loaf. It's amazing. And after this clip from the NAACP, the offertory will shift to the song Bread and Roses. And I don't know if you knew this, but Bread and Roses is from a workers' strike, a textile workers' strike from 1912. And during the protests, the police were called to protect the interests of the wealthy owners. And they broke up the protest with clubs, beatings. They threw women and separated them from their children and threw the children into paddy wagons. It was a disaster, a humanitarian disaster. And the protest was in 1912. In many ways, we are still marching for justice. The NAACP is organizing a virtual march on Washington on August 28th. And so consider how we might all continue to march for the bread of equity and the roses of justice.
Seeing the videotape is not always believing.
Ah, well, now we're getting to the heart of the matter, which is about the narratives that exist in our society that have been created and constructed about black people and that white people have internalized, and sometimes even black people internalize, about who we are. In the Rodney King case, I remember when they talked with the jurors afterwards, one of the jurors said he was like a Tasmanian devil and that he was in control of the situation the whole time. I remember hearing actually a very famous actress in an interview after Eric Garner was killed say about the officer who killed Eric Garner, obviously he was very frightened. The officer. So the idea that black men are inherently frightening or criminal, you see the effort to tear down the reputation, the character assassination that happens to black male victims and to black female victims. There's always an attempt to suggest that somehow the killing was justified. You always hear this person was no angel. This is to feed into the willingness of far too many white people to believe in the criminality of black people, to believe in the inhumanity of black people, and to believe that our word is worth nothing. When George Floyd was being held down and saying, "I can't breathe," one of the officers said, "Well, you're talking just fine." Not even when we're dying will they believe us. And that is because of these stories that have been created from the days of slavery to justify the most inhumane and immoral act, to justify it by suggesting that we were somehow deserving of the fate in which we found ourselves. And those narratives have been recycled and recycled and recycled so that we can't guarantee that when these cases come before a jury, that those narratives don't make their way into the jury deliberation room and wind up affecting the verdict.
We're coming up on 5 months of quarantine, and I am obsessed with bread. I apologize in advance to anyone who doesn't tolerate gluten. You may not enjoy this video. Back when things were regular, when a trip to buy groceries didn't feel life-threatening, I wasn't much of a bread baker. I mean, I could knock out a pretty decent challah on a Friday afternoon, but for the most part, I was perfectly happy to buy bread that someone else baked. But I always admired people who could keep a sourdough starter alive, people who understood the basics of no-knead, hot oven bread baking. I had made a few attempts, but with lackluster results. My friend Cindy once gifted me some sourdough starter with 2 pages of handwritten instructions on how to keep it alive and how to bake the delicious loaves that she seemed to be able to create effortlessly. I regret to admit that jar of starter languished unfed in the back of my refrigerator for years. It even had a neighbor in that unseen cold corner, a second jar of starter given to me by another friend, an expert baker. I recently added the slimy contents of both of these jars to our backyard compost pile while swearing that should anyone else ever trust me enough to give me a sourdough starter, I would be a stand-up, non-neglectful dough parent. Welcome to the new me. I feed my starter as often as I feed my cats, and I bake bread every day. I bake so much bread that I give loaves to my neighbors on the regular. I show my golden round loaves off to my students and friends on social media. I am an annoying bread show-off, and I am not alone. Across the country, as homebound Americans weather the months of physical distancing, baking has become a source of physical and emotional nourishment for people of all ages. So many people are baking that yeast and flour were in short supply. In April, I shipped 10 pounds of flour to my aunt and uncle in Brooklyn, New York. So far, we have been super lucky here in Vermont. Not only is our rate of infection from COVID-19 the lowest in the whole United States, but we are still able to purchase flour, yeast, and other baking supplies. I have been baking so much that I picked up my second 50-pound bag of King Arthur flour from the co-op. In some parts of the country, flour is available, but baking yeast is not. So the upsurge in interest in sourdough baking, in which the bread is leavened with starter instead of commercial yeast, makes perfect sense. People working from home have a lot more ability to take on lengthy kitchen projects, and some of us have a tremendous amount of what can rightly be called pandemic privilege. What is pandemic privilege? It's having a safe home to live in where we don't fear physical or emotional violence. It's having money to buy food and enough of a financial cushion to be able to afford 2 or 3 weeks of groceries all at once. It's having enough space inside our house that we can go into a separate room if our family members are annoying us. It's having a place outside the house, a yard or garden, a lovely place to take a walk and breathe fresh air. It's having Wi-Fi to be able to work remotely or complete our schoolwork online. I have all of these things and more. I have pandemic privilege. I also have pandemic anxiety that wakes me up in the middle of the night. I worry about my family in New York City. I worry about the hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons where social distancing is impossible. I worry about women experiencing physical and emotional abuse in homes they can't leave. I worry about Black Americans, who are 13% of the population, yet make up 27% of deaths from COVID-19. I wish I could make something useful out of my fear for the future, out of my rage at the injustice playing out in our country and in our own community, where elementary school teachers worry every day about whether their students are getting enough to eat. I wish I could transform my grief into something like compost, that dark, rich, magical substance that nourishes our garden plants. I wish it was safe for all of us to gather together in a circle, to hold hands and sing together, to break bread together, to send up a giant prayer for healing and safety. Right now, I am putting all of those wishes into the bowl with the sourdough starter, the water, flour, and salt. I am making bread for my neighbors. And this is a little postscript to this video. This loaf, which we take out of the oven when it reaches an internal temperature of 200 degrees, was very disappointingly flat. And it turns out that this is something that can happen with sourdough baking, especially when it's a really hot and humid day. So it still tasted delicious, but it wasn't the beautiful loaf that I had hoped to share in this video. So we have some pictures of other loaves that have come out of our kitchen over the last few months. And I'm looking forward to being able to break bread together again as a community when it's safe to do that. And in the meantime, I hope that you have everything that you need to thrive. I hope that you feel nourished physically and spiritually. May you be well.
My friends, there were so many good things baked into this service. I can't name them all. I just hope that by participating in the service or viewing it, that you have felt comforted and nourished with all of this good bread. In many ways, I started to see our community like I see Otter Creek Bakery, filled with so many good things that make the world a better place. And so, as you go into this week, may we continue to rise together. Blessed be.
Welcome to Social Hour. I would love to stay, but I think I need to run down and make some toast and have some bread. Let's see. People should be able to unmute. I would love to stay. So if people would feel free to chat and but with restraint. I think I've got pretty much everybody